Welcome to the full sweep of the Bible, not as a list of disconnected stories, but as one unfolding rescue. From a world called good at the dawn of time, to a world made new at the end of all things. This is the story of how God refuses to abandon what he made. Along the way, you will see gardens and deserts, kingdoms and ruins, songs and swords, betrayals and promises, failure and mercy. And if you stay with it to the end, you will see that the Bible is not mainly a collection of moral lessons. It is one great movement toward restoration. It begins before there were nations, before there were oceans, before there was a single human breath. There was only God. No skyline, no sunrise, no living creature, no history yet unfolding. Then the silence was broken. God spoke, and order entered the void. Light broke into darkness. Sky was stretched above the waters. Land rose. Seas gathered. Plants burst from the earth. The heavens were filled with sun, moon, and stars. The waters swarmed. The skies filled with wings. The ground trembled with living things. Again and again, creation answered the voice of its maker. Again and again, God declared it good. But then the pattern shifted. At the center of this newly made world, God created humanity in a way that made them unlike everything else. They were not merely another species placed into the landscape. They were made to reflect him, to live in fellowship with him, and to carry his rule into the world he had formed. The first man was shaped from dust and animated by the breath of God himself. The first woman was given as a companion, equal in dignity, made for relationship, not isolation. Together they were placed in abundance, surrounded by beauty, trusted with responsibility, and invited into life with God. Everything was open to them except one boundary, one command, one line they were not to cross. That line would become the center of the first rebellion. The voice that approached them did not arrive with open violence. It arrived with distortion. Doubt was planted before disobedience. Suspicion was planted before shame. The question was not simply whether they would eat. The question was whether they would trust the God who had given them everything. They reached for what was forbidden, and in that single act, innocence collapsed. Nothing looked the same afterward. They hid. They blamed. They feared the very presence they had once enjoyed. The world itself was bent out of shape. Pain entered. Toil entered. Death entered. Exile entered. The garden was lost. But even there, judgment did not have the final word. In the middle of consequence, a promise appeared. Evil would not reign forever. The wound had opened, but so had the first hint that one day it would be healed. Outside the garden, the fracture spread quickly. The first children born into the broken world did not reverse the damage. They deepened it. Jealousy became murder. Blood entered the ground. Violence became inheritance. Human life multiplied, but so did corruption. Generation after generation carried the same rebellion in new forms, until the world was crowded with people, but empty of peace. Still, one man stood apart. Noah walked with God in an age that celebrated everything twisted and cruel. While the earth filled with ruin, God announced that judgment was coming. Waters would cover what human violence had stained. But Noah was given instructions for survival before the storm arrived. He built an ark in obedience to a warning about a future no one else believed in. Then the flood came, not as a mythic symbol, but as a collapse of a world that had refused the goodness of its maker. When the waters fell and the earth emerged again, Noah stepped into a cleansed world carrying both relief and the old problem. God gave a covenant sign in the sky, a declaration that the flood would not be repeated as before. It looked like a new beginning, but it was not a new heart. Human pride rose again almost immediately. People gathered, not to spread under God's blessing, but to secure their own greatness. They built upward as if heaven itself could be reached by ambition. Their city was a monument to self-exaltation. Their unity was not holy. It was organized rebellion. So God scattered what pride tried to consolidate. Languages divided. Nations were born. And humanity was dispersed across the earth. Then the story narrowed. Out of the many peoples, God called one man. Abram was not introduced to us as a conqueror, a king, or the builder of some shining empire. He was simply called to leave. Leave the familiar. Leave the visible. Leave the world you know and go toward a promise you cannot yet see. God pledged land, descendants, blessing, and something even larger. Through Abram, blessing would reach all families of the earth. It was an astonishing promise. It was also, at first, impossible. Abram and Sarai had no child. Time passed. The body aged. The promise remained. This becomes one of the script's deepest patterns. God speaks first, and fulfillment waits in the distance. The gap between the two is where faith is tested. Abram believed, but not without struggle. He tried to solve the promise through human strategy. That produced pain instead of peace. Yet God did not throw the promise away. Abram became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah. Their names were changed before their situation was. And in old age, when the possibility seemed closed, Isaac was born. Laughter had once been the sound of disbelief. Now it became the sound of astonishment. Still, the story did not settle there. Isaac inherited the promise, but not without tension. His sons, Esau and Jacob, were divided before they fully understood themselves. Jacob grasped and schemed. He took what he wanted through manipulation. Yet even he could not outrun the God who had tied the promise to this family. On the run, Jacob saw heaven opened in a dream and learned that the blessing was moving forward, not because of human integrity, but because of divine commitment. Jacob's life became a long wrestle. He fought with others, with consequences, with fear, and finally, in mysterious form, with God himself. He emerged wounded and renamed. He became Israel. His sons would become the tribes that carried the story into national form. But before they became a nation, they became a fractured family. One son was favored. Joseph received a special place in his father's affection, and his brothers hated him for it. Dreams of future honor only deepened their rage. They stripped him, sold him, and sent him away. What looked like the destruction of one life became the hidden means of preserving many lives. In Egypt, Joseph suffered, descended, rose, interpreted, administered, and eventually stood in power before the very brothers who had betrayed him. When famine drove those brothers back into his presence, they did not know at first who stood before them. Joseph did. He could have crushed them. Instead, after testing their hearts, he revealed himself through tears. Evil had been real, but it had not been final. What was meant for harm, God had bent toward preservation. So the family was gathered into Egypt. They entered that land as guests under protection. They would not remain that way. A new ruler arose who did not remember Joseph, and did not care about the history that had brought Israel there. The descendants of Abraham had multiplied, and their growth made Egypt afraid. Fear led to oppression. Oppression hardened into slavery. Brick and burden became daily reality. Then came a decree aimed at the future itself. Hebrew sons were to be destroyed. One baby survived by being hidden among reeds and found where death was supposed to claim him. Moses was raised inside Pharaoh's world, and yet belonged to a different people. He sensed that tension early. In anger and misguided zeal, he struck an Egyptian and fled into the wilderness. Years passed. The man who might have imagined himself a deliverer became a shepherd in exile. Then, in the desert, God interrupted his obscurity with a fire that burned without consuming. There, Moses learned two things at once. God had seen the suffering of his people, and Moses would be sent back into the place he had run from. He resisted. He doubted. He argued. But the call remained. Back in Egypt, Moses stood before power with a simple demand: "Let my people go." Pharaoh refused. The conflict that followed was not merely political. It was theological. Who rules? Whose word stands? Whose power is ultimate? Egypt's river, livestock, crops, sky, health, and security were all struck in waves of judgment. Each plague peeled away the illusion that Pharaoh was untouchable. Yet he hardened himself again and again. Then came the night that separated households by blood. A lamb was slain. Its blood marked the homes of the faithful. Judgment passed through Egypt, but where the sign was present, death did not enter. At last Pharaoh broke. Israel left in haste, carrying the memory of terror and deliverance in the same breath. Freedom, however, did not immediately feel safe. As they moved toward the wilderness, the sea stood before them, and the army they had escaped thundered behind them. The people panicked almost instantly. It is one of the Bible's most honest patterns. People can witness astonishing rescue and still collapse in fear at the next threat. Yet the God who had broken Egypt was not finished. The waters opened. Israel crossed. The sea returned. The pursuing force vanished beneath it. What no path had offered, God himself provided. The people sang on the far shore. Then they started complaining. That rhythm matters. Deliverance did not remove distrust. In the wilderness, hunger made them nostalgic for slavery. Thirst made them bitter. Delay made them restless. Again and again God provided bread in the morning, meat in the evening, water from stone, victory in battle, yet the deeper problem remained. The issue was not only their circumstances, it was their hearts. At Sinai, the story reached another summit. The mountain burned, the ground shook, the cloud descended, and Israel was invited into covenant. God was not only rescuing a people, he was forming one. They were to become a holy nation, set apart, shaped by his commands, marked by justice, worship, truth, and love. The law was not random restriction. It was a picture of life, ordered under God. But while the mountains still thundered, the camp below betrayed the covenant almost as soon as it was given. Impatience turned into idolatry. Gold was shaped into a visible God. The people celebrated around an image while the living God was speaking from the mountain. The speed of the collapse is part of the point. Human beings do not drift toward faithfulness. Left to ourselves, we invent replacements for God almost immediately. Judgment fell. Intercession followed. Moses stood between a holy God and a rebellious people, pleading that mercy would not depart. New tablets were given. The covenant continued. The tabernacle was built. God chose to dwell among the very people who had already shown how unstable their devotion was. That tension drives the next movement of the story. Israel had been redeemed, instructed, and accompanied. The land promised to Abraham lay ahead. Yet, when spies entered it and returned, the people listened more to fear than to promise. The land was fruitful, yes, but the cities looked strong, the enemies intimidating. Faith saw a gift. Fear saw impossibility. Fear won tight. The result was devastating. The generation rescued from Egypt would not enter the land they had refused to trust God for. They would wander until their strength was spent and their graves filled the wilderness. What should have been a short journey became a generation-long lesson. Even in that long delay, the pattern held. Rebellion, consequence, mercy. Snakes in the camp, healing provided. Mutiny in leadership, judgment revealed. Need repeated, provision repeated. The old generation faded. A new one stood at the edge of inheritance. Moses, who had carried the people through years of resistance, would see the land from afar but not enter it. The story moved on without him. Joshua took the lead, and the Jordan became the next barrier. Once again, the obstacle was not merely logistical. It was symbolic. Another impossible crossing. Another act of divine opening. The river stopped. The people passed through. Stones were raised in memory. The message was clear. What brought them this far would bring them farther still. Jericho came next. Massive walls. A strange strategy. Silent marching. Trumpets. A shout. Then the impossible happened. The walls fell not because Israel had superior engineering, but because the battle belonged to God. Yet even in victory, one person's hidden greed brought defeat at the next city. The lesson was sharp. The land would not be possessed by military strength alone. Covenant mattered. Obedience mattered. Holiness mattered. Eventually, the land was divided. In one sense, the promise to Abraham had become visible geography. In another sense, the deeper struggle had barely begun. After Joshua's generation died, Israel entered one of its darkest rhythms. They forgot. They compromised. They worshipped other gods. Enemies overran them. They cried out. God raised deliverers. Peace returned for a time. Then the cycle began again. Judges is not chaotic by accident. It is repetitive on purpose. It shows what happens when a people want the blessings of God without living under the rule of God. Deborah rose in courage where men hesitated. Gideon fought with a tiny force so no one could confuse God's rescue with human brilliance. Samson embodied both extraordinary calling and tragic waste. Ruth, in contrast, showed quiet faithfulness in an era of instability. In a time of moral collapse, a foreign woman became part of the line through which the story would keep moving. Then came Samuel, prophet, judge, and transitional figure between the age of tribal disorder and the age of kings. Through him, the people demanded a king like the nations around them. They did not merely want leadership. They wanted a visible structure they could trust more easily than the invisible God who had carried them. So Saul was given to them, tall, impressive, kingly in appearance. At first he looked like the answer. Soon he became another warning. Saul had the throne, but not the steadiness to carry it well. He feared people. He acted without obedience. He preserved what God had said to destroy. He made excuses when confronted. His fall teaches something crucial in the Bible's logic. Appearance can launch a leader, but it cannot sustain a kingdom before God. So God chose differently. David was not the obvious son. He was out in the fields, overlooked in the lineup, not crowned by expectation. But God was not looking at height, public force, or royal polish. He was looking deeper. David would become the defining king of Israel not because he was flawless, but because his heart kept returning to God. Before he wore a crown, he faced a giant. The scene matters because it captures the pattern of his life. Where others saw an impossible enemy, David saw a chance for God's name to be vindicated. Goliath fell. Israel surged. David's name spread. Yet his rise did not go straight to the throne. He had to survive Saul's jealousy, wilderness years, betrayal, uncertainty, and waiting. Once again, promise came before possession. When David finally became king, Jerusalem became his city. The kingdom strengthened. Enemies fell. Worship was centralized. The ark came into the city. A covenant promise was given. David's line would not end in emptiness. A son from his house would carry a kingdom that reached beyond immediate history. But David's story did not stay bright. His sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah split open the weakness even in Israel's greatest king. He repented deeply, and mercy met him there. But consequences moved into his household. Violence, humiliation, rebellion, grief. David remained beloved, but not idealized. The Bible does not hide the cracks in its heroes, because its hope is not finally in its heroes. Solomon inherited the kingdom and began with brilliance. He asked for wisdom instead of wealth, and God gave both. Under Solomon, Israel reached a level of stability, beauty, and international honor it had never known. The temple rose in Jerusalem, a place of glory, prayer, sacrifice, and divine presence. Gold, cedar, song, order, splendor, everything seemed to suggest the nation had arrived. Yet the story had not reached its true answer. Solomon's heart drifted. Alliances became compromise. Foreign worship entered the realm. The king who built the temple also made room for idols. That contradiction would tear the nation in two after his death. The United Kingdom split. 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom, usually called Israel. Judah remained in the south with David's line. From there, decline accelerated. The north raced into idolatry with almost no interruption. The south had moments of reform, but never lasting enough to heal the deep fracture. Prophets rose again and again, not as decorative spiritual figures, but as covenant prosecutors and carriers of hope. Elijah stood against royal corruption and public compromise. Fire fell on Carmel, exposing the emptiness of Baal. Yet even after such display, the national heart remained unstable. Elisha followed, showing that the power of God was not exhausted, even when the kingdom's health was. Isaiah warned kings not to trust empires more than God. Jeremiah wept through the final days of Jerusalem. Ezekiel saw visions of glory departing and future restoration, beyond what exile could imagine. Hosea embodied covenant heartbreak. Amos thundered against injustice. The prophets kept saying the same thing in different ways. Your rituals cannot save you if your heart is unfaithful. Your politics cannot save you if your trust is misplaced. And your history cannot save you if you treat God's covenant as inherited immunity. The northern kingdom fell first. Assyria swept it away. The people were scattered. Their political story ended. Judah watched, and still did not truly turn. Babylon then rose, and Jerusalem's final days approached. Siege, famine, collapse. The temple was burned. The walls were torn down. The king was humiliated. The people were carried into exile. This is one of the Bible's deepest descents. The city of promise was in ruins. The place of worship was ashes. The people who thought their identity guaranteed safety now sat by foreign rivers, grieving what they had lost. And yet, even there, hope did not die. That is another unbreakable law of the script. The lower the descent, the more precious the next promise becomes. Jeremiah spoke of a future covenant written not merely on stone, but on hearts. Ezekiel spoke of cleansing, renewal, and dry bones raised to life. Daniel, serving in foreign courts, interpreted empires under the shadow of a kingdom that would outlast them all. Faithful Jews learned in exile that God was not confined to the land they had lost. He was still sovereign in the place of their humiliation. Then, after the years appointed, doors opened. Under Persian rule, exiles returned. The temple was rebuilt, though less glorious than before. The walls of Jerusalem were restored through opposition and resolve. Ezra called the people back to the law. Nehemiah rebuilt with one hand ready for labor, and the other for defense. It looked like restoration, but it did not feel complete. The nation was back in the land, yet still under foreign rule. The temple stood, yet not with the old glory. The promises remained, yet the fullness was still delayed. And then came centuries of waiting. That silence matters. It stretches expectation. It creates hunger. It teaches the audience to long. Then, in an ordinary corner of the world, the silence broke. Not in Rome. Not in a palace. Not in a military parade. A young woman, in an obscure town, received a message that changed history. She would bear a son not by ordinary means, but by the action of God's Spirit. Joseph, her betrothed, would need to receive the impossible before the world around him could make any sense of it. The child to be born would not merely belong to Israel's story. He would fulfill it. Jesus entered the world in weakness, not spectacle. His first bed was not a throne. His arrival was announced to shepherds and sought by outsiders from afar. Danger met him early. A jealous ruler feared what he represented before the child had ever spoken a public word. Yet the child lived, grew, and stepped into time, carrying everything the story had been reaching toward. When he emerged publicly, he did not begin by gathering armies or seizing institutions. He was baptized. He entered the wilderness. He faced temptation where humanity had failed from the start. But where others had fallen, he stood. Then he began to proclaim that the kingdom of God had drawn near. This is the center of the Bible's movement. Jesus did not come merely to comment on the story. He came to fulfill it. He called disciples, healed the sick, cast out demons, forgave sins, touched the excluded, challenged the religiously proud, calmed storms, fed crowds, opened eyes, and raised the dead. Everywhere he went, the world showed signs of reversal. Disorder retreated. Uncleanness was not contagious to him. His holiness moved outward. The broken were restored. The guilty were welcomed. The forgotten were seen. But the deeper he moved into public ministry, the sharper the conflict became. The common people were drawn by authority, compassion, and power. The religious elite were provoked by his freedom, his claims, and his exposure of their hypocrisy. He did not fit their control. He did not confirm their expectations. Even his miracles created division because they forced a question. Who exactly is this man? He taught in stories that opened one layer and concealed another. He spoke about seeds, sons, vineyards, banquets, shepherds, money, prayer, and mercy. Yet under every parable was a pressure point. The kingdom was arriving, but not as many imagined. God wanted repentance, not performance; mercy, not self-display; faith, not external polish. Again and again, Jesus hinted that the deepest rescue would not happen through immediate political triumph. The disciples struggled with that. So would the crowd. Everyone wanted glory. Few understood the road it would take. As he approached Jerusalem for the final time, the tension became unmistakable. Praise filled the road on his entry, but death shadowed the city. He cleansed the temple. He confronted leaders. He spoke openly of rejection. He told his disciples that suffering was coming. They resisted the idea. He did not soften it. At the final meal, he gave bread and cup new meaning. He spoke of body given and blood poured out. He knelt and washed feet, embodying the upside-down shape of his kingdom. In Gethsemane, the pressure of what lay ahead pressed him into agonized prayer. He was not trapped by events. He moved toward them knowingly. Then came betrayal, arrest, false accusation, mockery, political cowardice, religious hatred, public humiliation, and then the cross. To many watching, this looked like the collapse of the movement. The healer was beaten. The teacher was condemned. The one who had spoken of the kingdom was nailed up in weakness. Yet here the Bible's logic reaches one of its great reversals. The apparent defeat becomes the decisive victory. At the cross, Jesus bore what the whole story had exposed: sin, guilt, estrangement, judgment. He took into himself the consequence that had haunted humanity since the garden. When he died, the temple curtain was torn. Access changed. The old system had reached its fulfillment. Still, from the outside, death looked final. His body was buried. The tomb was sealed. Grief settled in. The followers scattered into confusion. But the story was not ending in a tomb. On the third day, the grave was empty. Not memory, not metaphor, not private inspiration. Resurrection. The women came first and found absence where death should have remained in command. Then came the appearances, the commission, the restoration of frightened disciples into witnesses. Jesus did not merely survive the cross, he defeated death itself. This is the great payoff toward which everything had been leaning. The serpent's work was struck. The curse was being broken. The true king had won, not by avoiding death, but by going through it and out the other side. Yet even this was not the end of the movement. Before ascending, Jesus told his followers that power would come and witness would spread. The story would not stay contained in one city or one people. What had been promised to Abraham was now expanding in force, blessing for all nations. At Pentecost, the Spirit came like a rushing disruption from heaven. Fire rested on ordinary people. Fear gave way to proclamation. Languages became instruments of gathering rather than symbols of permanent division. Peter, once shaken and compromised, stood before the crowd and announced that the crucified Jesus had been made Lord and Messiah. Thousands believed. The church was born. Its life was unlike empire. Shared possessions, public teaching, prayer, joy, boldness. Persecution came quickly because the same message that frees people also threatens systems built on control. Stephen was killed. Believers scattered. But scattering became expansion. The gospel moved into Samaria, then outward beyond old ethnic boundaries. Then came Saul. He entered the story as an enemy, zealous in suppression, committed to destroying the church. But on the road to Damascus, the risen Jesus confronted him. The persecutor was undone by the presence of the one he opposed. Blindness became the path to true sight. Saul became Paul, and the church's fiercest attacker became its most relentless missionary. Through Paul and others, the message traveled across cities, ports, synagogues, marketplaces, prisons, and households. Churches were planted in places that had once never imagined belonging to Israel's God. Gentiles were welcomed not as second-class additions, but as fellow heirs through Christ. This required another major clarification in the story. Salvation would not come by ethnic inheritance or law-keeping, but by grace through faith. The apostles wrote letters to guide these new communities. They addressed division, suffering, false teaching, sexual ethics, spiritual gifts, leadership, holiness, endurance, love, hope, resurrection, and the nature of the church itself. These writings did not invent a new message. They unfolded what Jesus had accomplished. All the while persecution intensified. Some believers were imprisoned. Some were beaten. Some were executed. Yet the church did not disappear. In fact, opposition often accelerated its spread. A faith worth dying for looked strangely powerful in a world used to compromise. Witnesses who could bless their enemies and face death without surrender became living arguments that something stronger than fear had entered history. And still, even after the resurrection, the spread of the church, and the formation of the New Testament community, the story remained unfinished. That is why Revelation matters. John, exiled and cut off, received a vision not merely about catastrophe, but about perspective. He saw Christ not in humiliation, but in unveiled majesty. He saw churches warned, corrected, and comforted. He saw conflict on a cosmic scale. Empires rose in beastly form. Evil concentrated itself in deception, coercion, and violence. Judgment moved in waves. The powers of the world strutted as though untouchable, but they were living on borrowed time. Babylon would fall. The dragon would not win. The Lamb who was slain would be seen as conqueror. Heaven's throne would outlast earth's tyrants. The final enemy, death itself, would not remain. And then the story reached its last horizon. A new heaven, a new earth. Not souls escaping forever from creation, but creation remade. The holy city descending. God dwelling with his people. Tears wiped away. Mourning gone. Curse removed. The tree of life appearing again, not behind guarded exile, but in the center of restored life. The long fracture opened in Eden is finally healed at the end. What was lost at the beginning returns transformed and secured forever. That is why the Bible feels so vast and yet so unified. It begins with creation and ends with new creation. It begins with a garden and ends with a city. It begins with humanity hiding from God and ends with humanity dwelling openly in his presence. It begins with death entering the story and ends with death thrown out of it. And at the center of all of it stands Jesus, not as a late addition, not as a side lesson, as the turning point. The sacrifices anticipated him. The kings foreshadowed him. The prophets pointed toward him. The exile deepened the hunger for him. The temple prepared the categories that he fulfilled. The cross accomplished what law and ritual could only describe in advance. The resurrection confirmed that the rescue had truly happened. And the promise of his return carries the whole story forward. So when you read the Bible, do not read it as scattered fragments of ancient religion. Read it as one long and deliberate story of promise, rebellion, judgment, mercy, covenant, rescue, and renewal. Read it as the account of a God who did not walk away from a ruined world. Read it as the drama of a kingdom arriving first in humility and finally in glory. And more than that, remember this: the story does not ask only to be admired. It asks to be entered. It calls for trust, repentance, hope, and allegiance. It invites the thirsty to come, the weary to return, the proud to bow, and the broken to receive mercy. This is the Bible's story. A world made, a world broken, a world pursued, a world redeemed, and a world one day made new. And the final word is not ruin. It is restoration.